Hey, sixth graders. Today we're going to talk about the difference in a ratio and a rate and a unit rate. And then we're going to utilize that information to solve problems with unit rates to find the best purchase that you can make on sale items. So let's get started. We've already talked about what a ratio is. You've learned that a ratio is a comparison of two quantities. And that was in RP1. So we're going to take it to the next level now, and in RP2, it says I'm going to be able to understand how to find a rate when given a specific ratio, and then we're going to apply that specifically to unit rates in RP3B to be able to solve unit rate problems. So under the umbrella of a ratio, which is a comparison of any two quantities, we get into a rate. A rate is a ratio in which two quantities with different units of measures are compared. So in this example, you see miles compared to hour, okay? So in ratio, it can be any two quantities. In a rate, it's gonna be a ratio that both of the quantities are different from each other. So they're going to measure in two different units. And then we get even more specific in unit rate. The word unit means one. So in a unit rate, it describes how many units of the first type of quantity corresponds to 1 unit of the second quantity. Now, if you'll remember from our first video, a ratio and a fraction are the same thing. A ratio can be written as a fraction. So if our second quantity is equal to 1, then that means that our denominator is equal to 1 in a unit rate. Okay, so in a unit rate, we can write it as the numerator over the denominator, or being divided by the denominator. And the denominator at the end, if it's truly a unit rate, the denominator is 1. Because in a unit rate, you're trying to say, okay, how much of the first quantity can I get for 1 of the second quantity? All right, so ratio leads into a rate, and if we get even more specific, it becomes a unit rate. All right, so in a unit rate, what we see is we can use unit rates for lots of things, like mile per hour, things like that. But in a unit rate, it gets down to 1. So we see a lot of things like using the word per, cost per unit, or price per unit. And a unit of measurement can be lots of different things, like a pound or a mile or a second, because we have different units of measure. So when I say unit, that can be lots of things. But we use the word per as we are talking about these rates, okay? So let's talk about how we use unit rates to find the best buy in real life situations, okay? So when we talk about creating a rate out of a ratio, if you'll remember from our first video, I told you that in ratios, the order matters so much. It's probably the most critical part of a ratio. Because if you change the order, you change the quantities, and that relationship is different. For example, if I say the quantity is 1 to 2, well, that's 1/2. If I change that relationship and I say 2 to 1, well, that's 2 divided by 1, that's 2. There's a difference when we swap the quantities. So the order matters in every ratio or rate problem that you see. So in this example, it says comparing unit rates to find the best buy. Well, in the first part, we're just going to be setting up the rate, and that comes back to RP2. Given a ratio, we're going to be able to set up the rate. Then we solve that rate to make it a unit rate, getting that denominator down to 1, and then we can compare those to find the best purchase possible. And that brings us to our steps. The first step is to use the order to set up the rate. A ratio, remember, the rate is a ratio with two different quantities. So in these situations, our rate is price per pound. okay? So those are very important because we need to know that we are setting it up price divided by pound, okay? If we divide pound divided by price, it changes the relationship. So that's where we get our setup over here, cost per unit and price per unit. So we're gonna set up the ratio to make it into a rate. Then we're gonna divide so that our denominator becomes 1, and that makes it a unit rate. So in this column, these are rates because they're comparing two different quantities. And in this column, it becomes a unit rate because now we are dividing to get the denominator into 1. The last thing that we're going to do is we're going to compare the price to find the best purchase. Now, this is a real life skill. It's something that your parents probably use all of the time when they go grocery shopping or when they're purchasing most anything. So when you think about that, when I look to see even if I'm either comparing the stores, like the price of a certain thing at different stores to see what store to purchase the item from, or I might look within one store at the different brands. You probably do this with your family at the grocery store. For example, if you're going and you're looking for cereal, you may look for the name brand or a different brand to see which one you get more for your money. That may be a way that you see it, more for your money, okay? And so that's called the best buy. So in this example, I've set up my rates. I've divided the rate to find the unit rate. And then when I divided the price per pound, I found my unit rate. Every single pound is worth 92 cents at this first grocery store. In the second grocery store, I can get 1 pound for 79 cents. In the third grocery store, I can get 1 pound for 95 cents. Now that I have changed it into a unit rate and gotten everything down to per pound, 1 pound, now I can compare the price and find the best buy. So if you're looking at this, remember from 5th grade when we compare decimals, we line them up and we go from the greatest place to the smallest place. And if you look at this, my best buy is the middle one for 79 cents per pound. So remember that a ratio leads into a rate in comparing two quantities, two different quantities, and a unit rate gets it down to where the denominator is 1 or per every 1 unit.